Hi everyone, welcome to Chapter 9 on Congress. And today we'll be talking about some competing tensions of representation. I'll give you a highlight of the structure and leadership of both the House of Representatives and the Senate. I'll talk a little bit about gerrymandering, how a bill becomes a law, and the federal budget process. So the founders believed that the concentration of national power should be in the legislature, right? We have a bicameral legislature. Bi means two, and this is firstly for historical reasons. Do you remember in the beginning of the semester when the framers were arguing about representation? Do we remember Virginia and New Jersey? Yes, the Great Compromise, right? AKA the Connecticut Compromise, created the bicameral legislature, right? One is based on representation, which is which? That's right, the House of Representatives. And the other one is based on the equality of states, right? The Senate. Everyone has two senators, no matter what state you're from. The second reason that we have a bicameral legislature is because of what is called an intra-branch check. Especially because there's so much national power concentrated in the legislature, the founders wanted to make sure that there was an extra check on this by creating two different bodies with two different sets of rules and powers, right? The House of Representatives and the Senate. So Congress has several functions, right? There's lawmaking, representation, providing service to their constituents, public education, conflict resolution, right? But the main functions are lawmaking and representation, right? They have to represent, ideally, the desires and demands of their constituents. But this is a little bit complicated sometimes. For representation, there are sometimes two opposing poles. So representation includes the need to represent the desires and the demands of the home state, right, the home district, but also represent the country's national interests, like these larger interests, like for instance, the environment or national security, right? That goes far beyond just local interests. And sometimes the desires of the constituents can be in conflict with the demands of national interests, right, or national policy. Anything that can be in the national interest, but maybe not in that particular local interest, right? So what's an example of this? So let's say there's a city with a military base. We know there's a ton of military spending, and it may be in the national interest to limit some of that, right? So it's in the national interest, let's say, to close the base. But the people that live in that state and live in that community are relying on the jobs and the local spending that is tied to that base, right? So if you have a representative from that district, does that representative look to the best interests of the nation, right, where we can definitely cut some military spending, or to the interests that are found in her home state, right? It's kind of a hard choice, and some of these are in conflict sometimes, right? Another way of looking at this is the tensions between constituents and interest groups, or constituents and interest groups and political parties, right? We learned how interest groups can give information to congresspeople and money to campaigns. So negotiating this influence with the local interests of the constituents can be in conflict sometimes, right? And then you throw in political parties, which can complicate things even further, right? Political parties can put pressure on party members to vote a certain way. An example of this is called log rolling, right? Saying that you will vote on someone's thing if they vote for your thing, right? You're exchanging political favors. And then, of course, you have to consider the structure of the system itself, right? Not just between local and national interests or between different local and national players, but also who's in the majority, right? Who's going to set the agenda? And we're going to learn about this in a couple of slides. So the Congress has set out, right, the powers of Congress. They are expressly given in Article 1, Section 8, right, the enumerated powers that are detailed in the Constitution, right? And we have three of the most important domestic powers being the right to impose taxes, to borrow and spend funds, and to regulate commerce. And the most important foreign policy power is the power to declare war. Congress also has the power to establish rules for its own members, to regulate the Electoral College, and to override a presidential veto. Some powers are reserved only to one chamber, right? So, for instance, the Senate must advise on and consent to the ratification of treaties, and also accept or reject presidential nominations of ambassadors, Supreme Court judges, other federal judges, and other officials of the U.S. And the Senate also holds the impeachment trials, right? These are just the powers of the Senate, right? In terms of the House of Representatives, all taxing or spending bills have to originate here in the House, right? The House has the power of the purse. I'll talk more about this actually next slide. So as we know, right, Congress is composed of two different but equal chambers, right? The House is much larger with 435 voting representatives. Plus there's also delegates from Washington, D.C., Puerto Rico, Guam, American Samoa, and the Virgin Islands. And they have 2-year terms, right? The House of Representatives people. And because these terms are shorter than the Senate, right? The Senate has 6-year terms. Because of these short terms, the House of Representatives is called the more democratic body, right? Because they have to be reelected every 2 years, these House reps have to be more in touch with their constituents, right? They're trying to keep their positions, they're trying to be reelected every 2 years. So we have this leadership here. I have just kind of a brief overview here. The House of Representatives is led by the Speaker of the House, who is actually second in line for the presidency behind the Vice President. The Speaker is the presiding officer of the House and actively works to set the majority party's legislative agenda. It's supposed to be a nonpartisan position for at last, but for the last 200 years, the Speaker has been the official leader of the majority party in the House. When a new Congress convenes in January of odd-numbered years, each party nominates a candidate for the Speaker, and of course support usually falls along party lines, right? Democrats vote for Democrats, Republicans for Republicans. So the Speaker presides over meetings, they appoint members of joint and conference committees, they schedule legislation for floor actions, and then refer bills or resolutions to the appropriate standing committees of the House. And they could take part in the floor debate and vote, but recently they just kind of vote to break a tie. Right, so they're the leader, right? And depending on who is the majority party in the House of Representatives, it could be a Republican or a Democrat, right? That's a majority leader. And these things change, right, based on elections. If the Democrats are the majority party, it will be a Democrat, right? And if the Republicans are the majority, it will be a Republican. And then each right. Okay, so we have the Speaker of the House here, right? We have the majority leaders and the minority leaders, and these are the spokespeople for each party. They try to maintain cohesion. They try to relay their party interests. I don't have this on there, but each leader also has what's called a whip or an assistant. So they assist the party leaders. They make sure that people show up on the floor debates, that they vote. They also conduct polls to get members' views on legislation. They're sort of the right-hand people of the minority and majority leaders, right? Okay, so we have the Speaker, we have the majority leader and his or her whip, the minority leader and his or her whip, right? So we also have the Senate, right? And that is made up of 100 people, right? 2 from each state. And there's a 6-year term, although they're staggered, so you don't have like an empty Senate every 6 years. So about a third are up for re-election every 2 years, right? It's kind of staggered. I forgot to mention, do I have it on this other slide? The requirements of the House of Representatives, right? You have to be at least 25 years old, at least a citizen for 7 years, and a resident of the state that you represent. Slightly different for the Senate, right? You have to be a little older, 30 years old, a U.S. citizen for at least 9 years, and of course also a resident of the state that you represent. The Constitution makes the Vice President the President of the Senate, but it's mostly a ceremonial position. The Senate selects a president pro tempore, or temporary, right, a temp, to act in the vice president's absence. Since 1890, the most senior senator in the majority party has generally been chosen to be this president pro tempore. But even this is a bit more, ceremonial. More junior senators usually take turns presiding over the sessions of Congress. And if you're interested, the president pro tempore is actually third in line to the presidency, behind the VP and behind the Speaker of the House. Right, so we have the leadership positions, the real leadership positions and power in the Senate in the hands of the majority and minority leaders, right, and their whips. They have the right to be recognized firstly in debates on the floor. They're kind of similar to the House of Representatives majority and minority leaders. They control the scheduling of debate on the floor. They influence committee assignments for their party and the other party. And they're expected to mobilize support for legislative and presidential initiatives. And they're also the liaisons with the White House when the president is of their party, and they try to coordinate party support. So we've seen some differences, right? Now that we have a better understanding of the differences between the Senate and the House, how do these play a role in the tensions that I kind of introduced in the first slide between local and national interests? So, for instance, the Senate has a 6-year term, right, and the House has a 2-year term. Why is that the case? Or you have to be 30 years old to be elected to the Senate, and only 25 to be elected in the House. Why is that the case? What were the founders thinking? Well, to give you kind of a short answer, there is a sense that the Senate is sort of the upper house and the House of Representatives is the lower house, right? You have this confirmation power for the Senate, right? The power to confirm the choices of the president for certain high offices. And so that kind of requires a different type of representation, what is going to be called, in the video that I'm going to show you on the next slide, trustee view of representation. Because they have to be less responsive to voters since they have 6-year terms, they're supposed to be the sort of cool heads prevailing, not constantly kowtowing to their electorate, right, to the people that elect them into office, that maybe is sort of a, less responsive, right? So they can make votes they can have votes that are more supposedly, objective, I guess you can say. And then you see in the House of Representatives, right, they have the power of the purse. And this is called the more democratic body because of these 2-year terms. They are very responsive to their electorate. And what the video will highlight as well is that is a good thing when it comes to money stuff, right? All the taxation bills and all the finance bills have to go through the House of Representatives first. This is where they originate. So you want this body to be the more democratic body, right? People want to be in more control of their taxes and financial issues that will affect them. So I will now show you this quick video to get into these details and how the different the different powers are related. And I've left this up here so we have a better memory of what we're actually looking at.
In general, the framers of the Constitution were kind of obsessed with the idea that the government might have too much power. So we'll be seeing a lot of examples of how they tried to deal with this. So let's finish up by looking at the reasons why the specific powers were given to each house. To do this, let me introduce my assistants, and by assistants, I really mean clones. Let's go to the clone zone! So I made these clones to help us understand these multi-sided issues. This is Senate clone, and this is House clone, and they're quite good looking, I might add. So you may have noticed, according to the Constitution, senators are expected to be older than representatives, and although 30 isn't all that old today, it was in 1787 when the Constitution was written. This was because older people are wiser, or at least more experienced, and the framers wanted the Senate, which is sometimes called the upper house, to be more serious, august, dignified, and above all, deliberative than the House. It was supposed to be more immune from the desires of the public, which the framers were kind of afraid of because of their unfortunate propensity to riot. One of the ways that the framers hoped to ensure this was by giving senators a 6-year term, which really would mean that they could ignore the rantings and ravings of their constituents for at least, 5 years at a time. Because the Senate is supposed to be the more deliberative body and the one that is more insulated from public opinion, they're the ones given the power to confirm public ministers and to ratify treaties. I guess they thought that, being older and wiser, senators would be better judges of character and better able to govern based on the sense of what is in the public interest. Sometimes the idea that a representative should govern based on what he thinks is best for the people rather than what they say they want is referred to as representative acting as a trustee. Which is another way of saying that the Senate is full of elitist snobs that don't care what their constituents want at all. In the House, representatives are supposed to take into consideration the desires of the people in their districts who voted for them, acting in the role of delegates. So the main way that the framers tried to ensure that representatives could be more responsive to their voters, other than having them directly elected by the voters instead of state legislatures, was to give them 2-year terms. This meant that they had to be responsive to the changing opinion of voters in their districts, otherwise they could easily be voted out of office. You don't want that. No way. Oh boy. Why they would be given the power of impeachment is sort of beyond me, but it totally makes sense to give the power of the purse to the branch of government that's closest to the people. After all, one thing that the government does that is directly related to almost everybody is taxes. So you want the most democratic body making decisions that have the most direct effect on people. Huh. Thanks, clones. So there you have it. That's the basics of our bicameral Congress, including the differences between the two houses and why they are that way. I used Latin again. I'm sorry. Mea culpa. We'll be going into much greater detail about how the two houses work together, or don't, in future episodes. But that's enough for now. Thanks for watching Crash Course. I'll see you next week.
Okay, so let's move on to single-member districts. So senators represent the entire state, right? There are 2 senators per state, and they represent the state at large, right? Unlike House of Representatives, who represent just a portion of their state, right? Some states are so small population-wise, they actually only have 1 congressperson, right? They have 1 person in the House of Representatives. For states that have more than 1 representative, the states are divided into what's called single-member districts. The area is divided into different voting districts, right? And each district chooses 1 representative. So here we have an example of Florida, and Florida has 27 members in the House of Representatives, right? Because it's coming out of 27 single-member districts, right? Each district votes for 1 representative, and that 1 person is elected to go serve in the House of Representatives, right? So number 1 will vote, number 3, number 6, number 17, either choosing a Republican or a Democrat, right? But it's actually not so simple. There's supposed to be equality in representation in election districts, right? This idea of 1 person, 1 vote, that your vote should count equally, right? No matter where you live, geographically speaking. Well, districts are supposed to be as equal as possible in terms of population, but there are challenges. Can you think of any issues that would make it hard to make equal districts? Looking at Florida, right? Is the population evenly distributed across the state? Where are the concentrations of populations, right? They're in cities, right? We have St. Pete down here in Tampa, Orlando, Jacksonville, right? That sort of skews things. It makes it very difficult, right? Or at least more difficult in order to kind of construct an equal district. And additionally, you have people that manipulate the maps to give themselves and their parties an advantage. And so this has caused some inequalities in representation. And this is what is called gerrymandering. So every 10 years, the United States conducts a census. And based on the results of this census, the states with more people are assigned a greater share of the House of Representatives, right? And if your population grows, you get more representation in the House, right? So if a state gains or loses representatives after the census is taken, then the state has to redesign the boundaries of its congressional districts, right? If it loses a person from the House or it gains them, right? So they have, so okay, right, so if a state gains or loses representatives after the census is taken, then the state redesigns the boundaries of its congressional districts. This is exactly what the yellow lines are, right? We're changing the grouping of voters. However, this can be done in a way that's beneficial to one party or the other, and that's what's called gerrymandering. So in a gerrymander, the party in control of the state legislature draws the lines to help themselves. It's definitionally the drawing of political boundaries to give your party a numeric advantage over the opposing party. So here in poli-sci land, so creative, before the redistricting, these are the existing districts, right? We have 2 Republican districts, right? The red squares are Republicans, and we have 1 Democratic district, right? After redistricting, which is when the yellow lines here are changed, right? There are 3 Republican districts and 0 Democratic districts. And why is that the case? Well, they've packed a majority of Republicans in each district, right? So the Republicans have a majority in each of these. So you actually lose a Democratic district, right? So this poli-sci land would send 3 Republican members to the House of Representatives. Let me see if I have another example here. So this is another example of gerrymandering called packing. This is what Florida's congressional districts looked like before 2015 when this was changed. This is sort of a famous example of gerrymandering. And I want you to focus on District 5 here. And what you see is a very oddly drawn boundary, kind of skinny and traveling down the state there, and it's packed with Democrats, right? Literally in a sea of red, you have a very strangely skinny district of blue, right, of Democrats. There's a ton of people that live in this blue area, right? It goes all the way up to Jax, all the way, it hits Gainesville, all the way down to Orlando. So if you think about it, if those Democratic voters were members of their neighboring districts, right, let's say there's a district like here and here, if we divided this in 3, let's say, they would be taking away the majority from the Republicans, right? Instead, they're all packed into this one district, and of course it's going to go Democratic, right? Because there's so many Democrats here. Maybe it's like 90-10, right? But this only gives the Democrats 1 representative in the House, even for all of these people. Because as you can assume, you know, these are like the 3 pretty huge cities in north central Florida, but they're all packed in 1 district, right? So not great in terms of fair representation. And this division is also along color lines. Do you know where the majority of African Americans live in Florida in the north, not considering Miami? Well, you'd be right if you would say the 5th district. This is a huge concentration of minority voters. So especially because of this sort of, you know, racial packing there, a judge recently in Florida last year in 2015 judged that this current congressional map violated a state law, right? You can't do this. This is not fair. So here I have a picture of the redrawing of the maps in Florida to reflect a more equal representation of Democrats and Republicans in the House. So here you have the old lines, right? We have this weird skinny 5th district thing here. And the new lines, which broke up a lot of that skinny line, right? So you have the old maps here, the new map here. Maybe this one would be more helpful. This is both of the districts. The gray is the old districts, and the red is the new. So quite a bit of a difference there. Here is an example of gerrymandering which favors Democrats. For District 17 in Illinois, the boundaries were drawn in a bipartisan deal, actually, to protect the Democratic incumbents, right, the incumbent that was in power, and also neighboring Republican incumbents. And the lines of the district were drawn to move Republican voters into the neighboring districts to include the Democratic neighborhoods of Springfield and Decatur. If you can see that, it gets really skinny right there. In District 4, down here, sorry, a little blurry, but that gives you a good idea of what it looks like. It was created to pack majority Hispanic parts of Chicago into one district. So one of the rules of redistricting is that the district has to be contiguous, right? It has to be one connected shape, right? So you get this lovely, strange earmuff shape that connects by a very skinny piece of the highway of Interstate 294. And this is considered one congressional district, literally going around another district, right? So I wanted to highlight sort of the process of how a bill becomes a law. Really to kind of highlight this important fact that the exact same bill has to pass in both houses before it goes to the president to sign. So, right, I'm going to link a video here that has a really great highlight of how a bill becomes a law. But to give you sort of a snapshot of that, basically a legislature introduces a bill, right? The bill itself is referred to a committee. And if the committee is if the committee is in majority that it should be voted on, it goes to the floor, and they vote on whether or not it should be open or closed. Right? If it's open, it would allow amendments or some changes. If it's closed, it wouldn't. And of course, if it's open and it does allow some change, it's harder for it to pass. And if it passes the Senate, let's say, it goes to the House, right? So it goes to the House of Representatives. It's up for a vote here. Now again, the exact same bill has to pass in both houses in order for it to go to the president for he or she to sign. And as you can kind of assume, this kind of rarely happens. There are a ton of changes that are generally made, and the process kind of goes through as many iterations as it has to in order for there to be consensus on the bill itself. So then let's say the House would try to come up with a compromised version of the bill, and it goes back again to both houses, right? So finally, if it passes, it goes to the president, right? And the president can sign it. But the president can also veto it, right? Decide that he or she does not want to support the bill, and it becomes nulled. And on the other hand, two-thirds majority of both houses can actually override a presidential veto as well. Now we talk a lot about the division of powers, right, in the executive, legislative, and judicial branches of government. And in terms of making a law, this is not this is the case in law making as well, right? So we have this intra-branch and inter-branch checks on the powers, right? Another thing I wanted to highlight, because you'll be hearing, and you should hear a ton of stuff about the federal budget and the budget issues in the news. The Constitution is really clear about where the financial power lies in the national government, right? It's in the House of Representatives. As we know, all taxing or spending bills have to originate in the House of Representatives. So today, a lot of the business of Congress deals with approving governmental expenditures through the budget process, and also with raising revenue to pay for government programs. So how does that work? Well, first, the president puts the in the budget request, right? Basically, the financial blueprint for the fiscal year. And this includes information on entitlements, discretionary spending, and that means basically everything besides the military. And so this discretionary spending stuff is what everybody argues about. The tax plans, right? Are we going to increase or cut taxes? And then also whether or not this budget will create a deficit or a surplus. Do we have enough money to cover it, or will the government run at a deficit? So number 1 through 3 are the procedures. The Budget Committee in the House and the Senate have to create a budget resolution, a rule book on how much we should spend. And it's divided out to different categories: defense, labor, energy, transportation, etc. And once these are approved, the resolutions go to the appropriations subcommittees. Each one is in charge of one of those divisions, and of course they make changes to any kind of stuff that would affect local interests, which are called earmarks, and by the fall there should be a packet of bills. And the process is near the end here. So a conference committee gets held, and once the reconciled version or the compromise version is passed, it goes to the president, who can either approve it or veto it. And if it's vetoed, the process starts again. So the process appears seamless, at least in theory, but it does often go poorly in real life. In 2011, Congress and the Obama administration couldn't agree on a budget, and it was getting down to the wire, and it nearly caused a shutdown of the government. And a shutdown actually did happen in 2013. Literally, the federal government was shut from October 1st to the 16th. And let's see, I knew I had a slide on that. So the shutdown was also caused by legislative issues in appropriating funds for the fiscal year, right? So during the shutdown, about 800,000 federal employees were indefinitely furloughed. That means they were put on leave. Another 1.3 million were required to report for work without really knowing a payment date. Of course, Congress was still getting paid. The previous government shutdown prior to this in 2013 was in 1995 and 1996 for 21 days. So this 16-day shutdown in 2013 was the third longest in U.S. history. And the reason why they were arguing and couldn't figure out a budget to agree on, it was over the ACA, right, Obamacare. They were trying to defund it or block implementation of it. According to the Washington Post, an ABC News poll, 81% of Americans disapproved of the shutdown. 86% felt it had damaged the U.S. image in the world, and 53% held Republicans accountable for the shutdown. And there was a pretty high cost for the shutdown. An estimate from the financial services company Standard & Poor say $24 billion. It's crazy. Another $3.1 billion was lost in governmental services, according to the research from IHS. There was $152 million per day in lost travel spending, according to the U.S. Travel Association. $76 million per day was lost because the national parks were shut down, right? You couldn't, for instance, go see any of the memorials or anything. And $217 million per day was lost in federal and contractor wages in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area alone. So Congress definitely has some power. I'm going to link up a couple of videos that give you a more detailed explanation of the federal budget process. It's really, I promise it's more interesting than it sounds, and it's a really excellent explanatory video that does fun stuff with, images, so you can have a better idea of what the budget process entails. And I think I will also link a video on how a bill becomes a law. Again, I know these aren't the most captivating and exciting things that you could study, but it's really, really important to know how a bill becomes a law and sort of a basic understanding of the federal budget So if you are reading the news or you're listening to stuff, hopefully listen to NPR or something, you'll have a really good understanding of what's happening, right? And as American citizens, it's really important for us to have a good, at least basic understanding of how the government works, right? Of course, as always, any questions, please don't hesitate.